Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about some of the legal aspects of real estate. So let's first talk about different types of ownership that you can have. So the most basic one is called a fee simple. Sorry, it's a red background, but I just circled this uh, word here. This is a type of real estate ownership, and it provides the highest degree of control, rights, and it's indefinite, meaning that if you buy property and you're taking a fee simple ownership of it, that you have that ownership indefinitely. Okay. Uh, it also, if you have a fee simple ownership, you can transfer your ownership freely. You're unrestricted in your transfer of your ownership. So if you are trying to analyze, like, if you're buying a property, a commercial property, and you want to see what you're gonna kind of be purchasing, you got to make sure that you're gonna be getting that. The best case is that you're gonna get a fee simple ownership. Okay. There are instances where, for example, if this is the case of like a fast food restaurant like a Arby's or like a Jack in the Box. Maybe that the person running that Jack in the Box has a 50-year lease. Okay, so they may be selling you the business and what you consider you're buying the property, but what you're really doing is buying their rights into a long-term lease. Okay, so you're not getting a fee simple ownership. You'd be buying the Jack in the Box, but after the end of that 50-year lease, the ownership and kind of that property, that Jack in the Box, that building would revert back to the landlord, the owner of the actual land. So, being clear about what you're buying when you're making a real estate transaction, this property ownership is going to play a factor. Okay, so I mentioned this long-term lease with the Jack in the Box. So this is a leasehold. So basically, there's two parties in a lease. There's the leasee, who is is the tenant basically, who holds rights to use the land or the buildings for some specific period of time. So in the case of the Jack in the Box, I said it was a 50-year lease. Uh, Most renters, when you rent an apartment, you're going to sign like a 6 month or a 1 year lease. So there's going to be some specific period of time, and then you basically are also limited in what you can do with the property. Like you can't, maybe the lease will say you can't have pets, or you can't run a business out of the property. There will be some restrictions as per the terms of this agreement that you, the leasee, the renter, is signing with the lessor, or who is the landlord. And then the other thing about a lease is that at the end of the specified period, if there's no new lease that's kind of signed, then the landlord, the lessor, will take possession of the property back. Okay. So if you are a leaseholder, if you are a leasee, then you don't have true ownership, long-term ownership of the property. You have use of the property and certain rights, but you don't have the full thing. Okay, a condominium. Okay, so when you buy ownership of a condo unit. Okay, so a condo unit is you could consider essentially like an apartment building or like a multifamily residential building where each unit is individually owned. So uh, there's going to be shared infrastructure. Like, so a condominium is going to share a roof, it's going to share plumbing, it's going to share some infrastructure, it's going to share even space, yards, common space with the other condominium owners. So there's some shared aspect to it. And then but you also own your individual unit. Okay, so it's kind of a mixed ownership where you're sharing certain parts of the property with others, and even the structure, right? So if there's like one roof and there's four units that are kind of covering the roof of all four units, you own just a part of that shared infrastructure, but your particular space you own fully. Okay, so this is kind of a mixed ownership between sharing with others versus having your own. joint tenancy and tenants in common. So the most common form of joint tenancy is a married couple. So when you own a property as a married couple, if one of you dies, then the other one gets the full ownership of that property. Okay, so this is a kind of shared ownership between people. You can have a joint tenancy that is fee simple, meaning that you and your spouse own the property in a fee simple way, but you as an individual are kind of sharing the ownership. Okay, tenants in common is the same, where there could be five different parties that come together and want to buy a property, and maybe one person is going to be a 20% owner, one person is going to be a 5% owner, one person is going to be a 30% owner, etc. And so a tenant in common ownership structure will allow those five parties to come together and own one particular parcel. Okay. Um, so again, a tenant in common TIC, as it's called in kind of real estate, within real estate professionals. They can own a property fee simple. Okay, it's just how many people own it together. And so, you would see on the deed when you bought a property, you would see all the tenants in common listed and their respective percentages. Um, okay, so let's move on. So when we talk about rights, okay, so when we talked about the fee simple ownership has the most complete set of rights to a property. So what are these? What are these rights? So you can remember the rights, the basic rights of a property with the acronym DEEP C. So what does it stand for? So disposition. Okay, so this is basically the ability for you to be able to transfer your property as you see fit. And it's not just selling, it's also leasing, it's also transferring part of your ownership, if you wanted to add a tenant in common. So this ability to be able to uh, change the ownership or change the uh, yeah, like who's involved with the property, also even again just leasing it out to someone. This is all part of disposition. Uh, these this right can be restricted. So, for example, in San Francisco, they have these. They're usually condominiums where you can buy them. They're selling for very cheap. This is part of the affordable housing program in San Francisco, where the unit is very cheap, and so when you buy it, you will own the property, but you will be restricted as to who you can sell it to. You'll have to sell it to someone else who meets kind of these low income requirements, like their household income has to be below a certain amount, and there will be a price. Like you won't be able to sell it for whatever price you want. There will be some limits on how much you can sell it for. So this is a imposition of a restriction on your disposition rights if you choose to buy one of these low income properties in San Francisco. Okay, so this is an example of how these real estate property rights can be kind of restricted through law or through some other means. Okay, exclusion. This means that the owner has the right to prevent others from using or entering the property. Okay, so uh, sometimes, so I'll give you an example of how this can also be restricted. So you may buy a property, like let's say you're buying a country property. There may be a road that runs through your particular parcel of land that's used by your neighbors. Okay, so when you buy that property, you're gonna likely take ownership of it subject to what's called an easement. Okay, so the other neighbors will have at some point negotiated with the owner at that time to basically allocate some of their property to be used for common use. Uh, and so going forward, after that agreement has happened, usually the neighbors will pay the owner for that kind of that use. So that owner benefited. They sold kind of part of the property for common use. And then going forward, they will have to transfer the land subject to that use. Okay, so uh, this is something that if you bought a property that was subject to an easement, you cannot prevent your neighbors from going on that road because easement had already been recorded and negotiated. Okay, so this is an example of losing your ability to exclude a use of a property. Enjoyment. So this is the next part of the property rights. This is basically the owner has the rights to use the property in any manner that they see fit, as long as, of course, it's legal. Okay, you can't use it if prostitution is not allowed in your uh, state or town or whatever. You can't use it as a brothel. So it has to be legal as per the laws of that particular jurisdiction. Now, it can be things like living in, using it for business, leasing it out. There are restrictions to this too. So, for example, if you owned a condo, if you bought that condo, you would have been buying the condo subject to the rules of that condominium association. Okay, so some condo associations, they limit the percentage of the units in the development to be rented out. So maybe they say if there's 10 units in the condo development, only 30% of them can be occupied by renters. Okay, so if you bought the property and there are already 3 units that were occupied by renters and you bought it, you would be restricted from being able to rent it out to anyone else. Okay, because you bought that condo subject to those particular restrictions. Okay, so uh, enjoyment can also be restricted in this way. Okay, possession is the next one. And possession just refers to the right of uh, the owner to possess and occupy the property. Um, this can be restricted by the owner themselves by, for example, leasing the property. So if you lease the property to a tenant, you can't just show up there and like, sit on the sofa, put your feet up. You will not be allowed to just come onto the property, even though you own it, because you've kind of given those rights for in exchange for rent to your tenant, and so you've kind of given up your full rights of possession. Okay, of course, if the tenant stops paying you rent, you can recover that right, but while the lease is in force, you've kind of given up that right of possession. Control. So basically, this gives the owner the right to control the use of the property, and basically, this has a lot to do with land use. Okay, what can you build on the property? What improvements can you add? Um, and really, the big control on your control rights to your property are zoning restrictions. Okay, so a town, a municipality, the state, they will have laws that govern what you can use your land for. Okay, so if you're gonna buy a property in the city of San Jose, you're gonna be buying that property subject to all the regulations that that city has kind of put into place for parts of all parcels that fall within the city's boundaries. Okay, you could choose to just buy land in the county that's not part of San Jose City, like in Santa Clara County. You could, if you don't like the laws that exist in California, you can buy property in Nevada, which have far less restrictions. So you can choose to buy property with more or less restrictions from the governments, but typically there's going to be some level of restrictions on control by government entities. Um, there are, of course, many jurisdictions that have very minimal, if any, but for the most part, especially in cities, there's going to be zoning and other restrictions on use.